Magandang gabi, magandang umaga. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to gather with all of you tonight, this afternoon, this morning, depending on the region of the world you're getting connected from, to hear about the ongoing human rights crisis in the Philippines. As I introduce myself, I'd like for all of you to think about your lands, your family, and your ancestors. My name is Roxana Bendestu. My pronouns are she, ella. I'm a descendant of the Quechua people of the Andes. I've made my home and built my close community in a territory that has been and continues being cared for by the Ino and Occaneechi communities, as well as the Tuscarora Nation, currently an area known as Durham, North Carolina. I mention these specific details because it is crucial to ground ourselves in our own stories. Everybody, racialized and non-racialized people, everybody has a story. Stories that include traditions, land, cosmovision, a way to see the world, that have shaped us and that have gotten us to where we are right now. The deeper we dig into these stories, we find that the root causes of much of our oppression and or privilege intersect with most people in the world. Some of the examples, of course, are colonization, imperialism, racism, homophobia, patriarchy, misogynism. We are the ones who need to tell our own stories. And that's the reason why we're here, to uplift those voices of people who need to tell their own stories with their own voices. And thank God for technology that we're able to bring them to this virtual space to share with us what they are going through, but also how they're organizing, how they're resisting. And so we are lucky at Pax Christi USA to have a person like Michelle Sherman, also with roots in the Philippines, and who's going to be moderating this conversation tonight. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Michelle Sherman.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much. Good evening and also good morning to those who are joining from the Philippines. Yes, I am so happy that all of you decided to join us to learn more about the ongoing human rights crisis in the Philippines. We know that an hour is not enough to share everything that we'd like to, but we hope that this next 55 minutes will at least allow us to learn more and to hear from folks who have been engaged with this struggle, both in the Philippines and in the USA. On your screen, you'll see the ecumenical letter from three organizations that we wrote and then also shared for sign-ons. As earlier this month, the world commemorated International Workers' Day. President Biden welcomed the White House Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. The timing of this meeting between the two presidents highlighted the urgent need to uplift the voices of people in the Philippines who continue to experience human rights violations. On Monday, May 1st, representatives of the International Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines, Bayan USA, Pax Christi USA, and more were present for a vigil and rally outside the White House. In preparation for the event, 130 faith communities and 500 individuals signed this ecumenical letter to Biden to heed the voices of the oppressed and halt the US military aid to the Philippines and to support the Philippine Human Rights Act. I'm going to pass it over to Nina, who is one of our speakers. I'll introduce her more later as we have the panel, but I'd like to invite her now to share on the basic content on the Philippines for some context.
Thank you, Michelle. It's really nice to be here with you all. Just very quickly, because I'm sure people have differing contexts on the Philippines. So the Philippines is a Southeast Asian country. You can see it on the map here, circled with an arrow pointing at it. It is an archipelago with over 7,100 islands, and it's roughly the size of Arizona with almost 114 million people. It's an underdeveloped agrarian country with 75% peasant population and 25% in the cities. There's also one of the largest Filipino diasporas in the world. So there's 12 million overseas Filipinos that are outside the Philippines. It's also important, and I think Sarah will expand on this, so I won't belabor this point, but the Philippines was a previous colony of Spain, and the Philippines on the brink of winning its liberation from the Spanish, the Philippines was actually sold to the US for $20 million by Spain because they couldn't bear to be beaten by brown people. And then it was a colony of the US for a long time before it was given its sham independence, but now it's still very much a neo-colony of the US. And the Philippines' strategic location in Southeast Asia makes it very important as an outpost for the US. So yeah, that's just a quick background on the Philippines.
Thank you, Nina. The next slide shows an overview as Nina set up our context. Since Rodrigo Duterte left office last summer, violent repression and gross human rights violations have only continued under Ferdinand Marcos II regime, including the illegal arrests of faith leaders, Reverend Nathaniel Valente of the United Church of Christ, and Reverend Glofi Buntong of the United Methodist Church. As the Investigate PH reports compiled in 2021 by the International Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines, ICHRP concluded, the human rights crisis in the Philippines is systemic. So many of us on this call, and I also see faces of delegates that went to the Philippines as part of an interfaith learning tour. We went and it was sponsored by ICHRP, International Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines. ICHRP, as you'll see there, is a global network of organizations concerned about the human rights situation in the Philippines and committed to campaign for just and lasting peace in the country. And so it was within this context that their faith working group welcomed 14 delegates. You'll see on the next slide some of our faces. And we were divided into 4 teams to conduct interviews in 4 regions: Cagayan Valley, Negros, Eastern Visayas, and Cagayan de Oro. These interviews were conducted in collaboration with local host teams, as well as members and the national planning team. Our findings echoed that violations of international humanitarian law by the AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines, the PNP, the Philippine National Police, and the Philippine government. And I won't go through all the recommendations, but you'll see there are a number there that particularly relate to the US and the Philippine relationship, including the recommendation that the United States and all foreign countries should cut military aid and cease the arms trade with the Philippines until the perpetrators of war crimes are held accountable, and that we call on the United States to investigate possible incidences of the use of US security aid used in human rights abuses in the Philippines. So I would also like to take this moment to thank one of our delegates, Jordan, who is from United Methodist Church, and Malaya Movement USA, who helped design these slides that we are using. So now for the rest of the flow of this evening, we will have 3 speakers. I'll introduce them, and they're going to speak on various points about the Philippine human rights situation, US militarism, the current context that we are in. And I'll introduce each one before they speak. They'll have about 5 to 7 minutes to share about that topic. And then we will move into question and answer. And then We will end with some action steps, some ways to get involved. So our first speaker this evening is Sarah Raimundo. She is a scholar of Indigenous Studies and teaches at the University of the Philippines Center for International Studies. She is an activist from Bayan, or the New Patriotic Alliance. Sarah will speak about the historical context of the US in the Philippines, US counterinsurgency method embedded into the Philippines, called the whole of nation approach, and civil society organizing within the Philippines. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, good morning, good evening from the Philippines. I thank the organizers of this forum, Pax Christi, Migrant Roots Media, for this opportunity to reach out and build international solidarity. I will share a brief look at Philippine society, which will hopefully serve as an introduction to some of its aspects that speak to the struggle of the Filipino people for national liberation and justice. So let me begin with something familiar to us all, food. Okay. So Filipino food was prepared by Malay settlers, spiced by commercial relations with Chinese traders, stewed in 300 years of Spanish rule, hamburgered by American influence on the Filipino way of life. That was the historian Mercado in 1976. We have a very rich history of trade, cultural exchange, and so on and so forth, but also of colonialism and resistance against colonialism. We have over 108 languages spoken by various ethno-linguistic groups and indigenous peoples. We have a 81% Roman Catholic, and these are the other denominations in the Philippines. It's a highly religious society. And to actually give you a, basically the main reason why we're here is because we Filipinos have a problem. And the way to frame and try to explain that problem is by sharing something that is also familiar to you. For better or worse, we are all part of government. Ours is very much entangled with the United States government, historically, economically, and politically. So here's a little bit about ours. So the origins of government here in the country is a continuity of leadership recruitment from a tiny minority of elite families. In spite of democratic elections, members of these elite families get elected again and again. One scholar, Dante Simbulan, who's already based in the United States, who was formerly with the Armed Forces of the Philippines and defected and joined the revolutionary underground during the Marcos period, wrote the book Modern Principalia. So in this book, he explains that it is the ruling elite in every province of the country. These are political dynasties, and to this day, they're very much still, they still govern. And they're a product of colonialism and imperialism. So in such a setting, democracy can never really happen because what happens is that families hold on power is just transferred from the grandfather to the grandson or daughter and so on and so forth. And these are the methods of manipulation of the elites, bribery, use of taxpayers' money, buying off of public relation agents, the liberal use of guns, goons, and gold. So this is the kind of democracy that the oligarchy inflicts upon the people. So the modern Principalia, or we also call them bureaucrat capitalists who use their position in government to profit instead of serving the people. They have a history in the establishment or in the development of Philippine society. So during the Spanish colonial period, there were land grabs, and there was really brutal killings of the native population. But of course, they were able to consolidate a few who were willing to cooperate with them. And they will later on become the cabeza de barangays and so on and so forth, who will later, of course, be part of the ruling elite or the ruling Principalia. And then, of course, there's always been resistance to colonialism since they set foot on the islands. And the peak of this resistance happened in 1896, the Katipunan Revolution. It was a anti-colonial, anti-feudal revolution. But this particular revolution was hijacked. The Philippine independence was hijacked by US imperialism. And since then, US imperialist rule has been all about counterinsurgency. And that means the repression and suppression of a people who never stop resisting colonialism. Since then, counterinsurgency has defined the mode of governance in the Philippines. If you ask a woman like me, who's been born and raised here, about what I think of counterinsurgency, it means it is a suppression of a people who want to get free by a government that bows down to another. So this is the Philippine-American War, an important note on Philippine history. It took place from 1899 to 1902. Half of the population was killed, 2 million Filipinos, and almost 1 million of them were killed during the Filipino-American War. And this genocide is not really talked about in history books. And then another highlight of our history is that as the US, United States, rose to superpower status after World War II, the Philippine government was established by the Americans to prepare us for the so-called post-colonial period. But they never left us because the US oligarchy established Philippine representative democracy, the Philippine military, two important aspects of statehood from which the Filipinos still have to take back and own independently. So the struggle for national sovereignty never stopped and reached its peak in the 60s and the 70s, along with the global wave of revolutionary struggles, especially in the Third World. It reached its peak in the anti-dictatorship movement in the Philippines when the Filipino people struggled against the United States-backed Marcos martial law. So apart from political repression, the state also rolls out economic terrorism through unequal trade agreements that have the effect of strangulating Filipino workers and farmers. So-called modernization for economic growth by the World Trade Organization, the IMF, World Bank, ASEAN are actually for the accumulation of profit for the global north. And one very dominant mode of labor in the Philippines is called the overseas Filipino workers phenomenon. It's basically the transfer of value from the periphery to the center, to the imperialist core. The cost of education and training for this labor is being shouldered by the Philippine government, by the taxes of the Filipino people. And we're also experiencing a climate of impunity. And this has been mentioned by Michelle. So you have human rights violations right and left. You have an anti-terror bill targeting critics of the government, not really terrorists. And you have the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which is part of the whole of nation approach that was been copied hook, line, and sinker from US counterinsurgency. So the climate of impunity is something that is anchored on US coin. But of course, we have struggles. The Philippine Revolution has not stopped despite the hijack of US imperialism in 1898. So you have the Revolutionary Communist Party, you have the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and these are armed revolutionary movements, in particular, the National Democratic Front, which represents the Armed Revolutionary Group and the Communist Party. They carry out three aspects of the underground revolution, namely agrarian revolution, mass base building, and a defensive armed revolution toward land redistribution and national industrialization. This is being carried out in the countryside. We also have a mass movement, which is an anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, open legal organizing in the urban areas that pushes for land redistribution and sovereign economic industrialization. These two are parallel movements that are similar in terms of vision for independence or national liberation and economic sovereignty for the Philippines, but they use different methods for different contexts. Both movements also call for peace talks that is not necessarily about wiping out the revolutionary struggle, but putting the comprehensive agreement on social and economic reforms on the agenda, or as an agenda for peace for both the Philippine government and the National Democratic Front. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking forward to our question and answer because there's so much that that you were able to encapsulate in a short amount of time. Thank you for your ongoing work. Our next speaker is Joanna De La Cruz. Her nickname is Chikai, and she goes by she, her, and Sia. She is the Assistant Program Secretary for the Human Rights Work from the Program Unit of Faith, Witness, and Service of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. Chikai is an ecumenical worker, activist, human rights defender, and a firm believer in the people's movement. Chikai will be sharing about faith-based work in the Philippines and anti-imperialist work in the churches. Welcome, Chikai.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. Good morning, good evening to all of you, and thank you to all the organizers, to Pax Christi, to our friends and comrades in the international solidarity work. It's just to delve or piggyback on what Professor Sarah has mentioned. The US imperialism in the Philippines has also contributed a lot in terms of perpetuation and assertion of poverty by allowing, Western nations to bring in capital and technology. So the Philippines, just to add on that, is also in pervasive cycle that is under the country is underdeveloped and also very much repressed. For the churches, here in the Philippines, the church plays a vital and significant role in the promotion and protection of human rights, rooted in the belief system that humans are created in the image of God. So churches here are driven by faith by ensuring God's image in all of us are respected and not violated. For our organization, the NCCP, our concern for human rights work must be based on the context of Christian discipleship, witness, and solidarity. The imperative to serve fellow human beings in their needs as far as human rights is concerned means preservation of humanity, protection of all persons, and guarantee that persons are created in the image of God. Christian discipleship requires that human beings, for us, must be afforded the right to speak freely, present their needs and aspirations in a context of justice and equity, and be given the chance to decide for themselves freely. This also means to be protected from oppression of their fellow human beings, from the arbitrary use of power by the government, from unjust structures of society, and from the constant threat of the integrity of their being as human persons, and thus to guarantee access to those means by which their survival may be met. Therefore, God's redemptive plan for humanity is the recognition of people as beings created in the image of God, free from dehumanizing, oppressive, and exploitative structures. So in doing God's plan, as church people here in the Philippines, we must not allow human dignity to be distorted, defaced, and shattered by unjust structures that are purported by imperialist design. In addition to that, enormous social, political, economic structures cripple the ability of the people to meet the basic necessities of human life. Severely unequal distribution of wealth are very pervasive here in the Philippines and ever growing. And there's also ever growing gap of the rich and the poor that reduces life to a level of survival. Thus, for the churches, the struggle for human rights is the struggle for human dignity of the vast majority of our people. As churches, when we speak of human rights, this does not only include civil and political rights, but also social and economic and cultural rights. So when these rights are denied and violated, God's image is also violated in us. So as churches, it is our responsibility to witness, to be with, to work with the people, and therefore to claim, restore whatever the rights that have been denied and trampled upon. So the NCCP, as part of an ecumenical community, we continue to fight for human rights here in the Philippines. And because there are also several cases that has been happening, including human rights violations. This includes torture, illegal arrest, detention, threats, and enforced disappearances. And just recently, there are at least 21 abductions or disappearances that were reported under the current dispensation of Marcos Duterte regime. And this included young people in former University of the Philippines student Patricia Sherva, a peasant organizer, and Cedric Casano, a peasant organizer also from Cagayan Valley. Also, we call on the government to, as part of our witnessing, we call on the government to surface 2 indigenous rights activists that were also abducted by suspected state forces. There are Dexter Capuyan and Bazu de Jesus from the Cordillera region. There are actually indigenous rights activists. And these situations that has been happening is very reminiscent of the dictatorship of the martial law years during President Marcos Sr. So human rights violations continues. We also have like tortures, illegal arrest, detention, threats, and intimidation, and even red tagging of shockingly included respected leaders from the churches, and also human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists, as well as church people. Michelle, a while ago, mentioned the cases of Reverend Gloffy Baluntong from the United Methodist Church and Reverend Valiente from the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. So these are our church leaders, our clergy, who were slapped with trumped up charges. They are actually humanitarian workers and peasant advocates, but because of their work, they are being targeted, primarily for fulfilling their Christian mandate and mission of ministering to the poor and the marginalized. So while undertaking their prophetic task as Christians to be with the people, especially in times when basic human rights of the people and communities are undermined, this compels them to be and speak with the people and defend God's image in all of God's image in every human being. So thus, this clearly tells us that the people's struggle for justice goes on, even in the midst of repression and even in the midst of imperialism. So as church people, we are challenged to confront injustices in all its forms. So what do? First, we form networks with other churches and civil society organizations. So we partner with campaigns to help raise public awareness, to put pressure on the state authorities by building information brigades, coordinating with media practitioners, and issuing press releases and statements. We also hold public events like educational discussions, such as what we have right now, in schools, offices, in communities, and even in the grassroots. We organize support systems and build support systems for victims and families of human rights defenders, which include legal aid and putting up sanctuaries, especially for those who are in need or in hiding. We also join, coordinate, and mobilize public advocacy actions against political repression, not only here in the Philippines, but internationally. Thus, we also disseminate campaign materials to articulate peace, justice, and mercy work of the churches. Then again, we also press for a deeper investigation of the violation of human rights committed by the Philippine government including the formation of an impartial, independent, and credible commission that will conduct an investigation to these cases. The United Nations is a very good platform for this, and also the International Criminal Court, where it will help in the investigation of these cases and aid in the prosecution, trial, and punishment, supposedly of the alleged perpetrators. Then we also continue to monitor all the complaints that are being filed right now with our Commission of Human Rights and in the Office of the President, for example. Then we also lobby the government to carry out recommendations raised at the United Nations. We have a special mechanism of the United Nations called the Universal Periodic Review, where every 4.5 years, each member state is being reviewed, and the Philippine state receives recommendations from different states on their human rights compliance. So we continue to use that mechanism by submitting shadow reports from the different NGOs or organizations. With this also, we file cases and send letters of allegations to special mandates and special rapporteurs at the UN, at the United Nations, especially on the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion. So thus we submitted the case of Reverend Bluffy Baluntong and Reverend Valiente. So also, in addition to that, we continue to campaign for rendering justice to the victims of human rights violations committed by the state forces by pressing accountability of alleged perpetrators in prohibiting the granting of any form of immunity for them. And then, of course, like what Professor Sarah had mentioned, we support the campaigns for the resumption of the peace negotiations between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. And like what we are doing right now, we continue to build solidarity networks locally and internationally, and continue to invite you, hopefully you come to the Philippines, for you to know the real and pulsating situation of the people in the grassroots, to know and listen to their stories, to live their lives, connect with their struggles, because all our struggles are connected, and know that this work of imperialism must be destroyed and brought down. So the work for pursuing peace and justice here in the Philippines is also a work that we have to do all around the world, because we are all victims of imperialism. And as people of faith, or as people united, we can always imagine a better world for us. So that would be I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chikai. I feel like I could listen to you speak and preach really for much longer. So thank you again for sharing with us, particularly around the spiritual grounding and the social strategy and organization of church workers, as you said, for peace, justice, and mercy. And so I know several of the folks on the call are with Pax Christi, and so that both hand in hand of contemplation and action, social action, is very important to us. Our next speaker, our third speaker, is Nina Makapinlak. Nina is the Secretary General of Bayan USA, an alliance of 30 grassroots Filipino organizations across the United States that are fighting for genuine democracy in the Philippines. Bayan USA is the first overseas chapter of Bayan Philippines. Nina is currently based in New York. We're so happy to have you back, Nina, because you were a speaker for the 50th anniversary conference for Pax Christi USA. So welcome back, I should say. Nina will be sharing about Philippine Solidarity organizing work in the US, the impact of US bases in the Philippines and EDCA, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreements.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, it's really nice to be back. Yeah, I always love working with Pax Christi and collaborating on events. I'm also practicing Catholic and also a church organizer at a Filipino ministry alongside Annie, who will also speak after me. Excuse me, I'm also recovering from bronchitis, so please bear with me. So I'm just going to go over a timeline of recent events on US-Philippine relations. So last September, and as Professor Raimundo already set up, there's a long line of traditional politicians who have totally plundered the Philippines and have been corrupt since the very beginning. And right now, the current president is President Bongbong Marcos Jr., who is the son of the infamous dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who I think some of you might be familiar with, grew up seeing and hearing about him and his wife with the million shoes. But his son is back in power. There's actually a question in the chat that's relevant, asking, oh, wasn't there a nonviolent revolution or the uprising, the people power uprising that ousted him? And yes, there was. However, there was not fundamental qualitative change in terms of how Philippine politics and economy was structured. So even the following administrations repeated a lot of the different things that Professor Raimundo outlined, like counterinsurgency, failure to address the agrarian problem in the Philippines, address the root causes of unemployment and job and poverty. Basically these problems persisted, and the family, Marcos's family, also launched a 30+ year disinformation campaign, and were able to climb back into power, also through fraudulent elections. So now we have the Marcoses back, and the Philippines remains largely unchanged. So in September, Marcos came to the US. Before this, he actually wouldn't have been able to enter the country because there is a warrant for his arrest due to the different human rights abuses of his family. But because he has diplomatic immunity, he was able to enter for the first time in a long time. And he actually addressed the UN General Assembly on the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law under his father, which was a huge affront to the Filipino people. In November, Kamala Harris visited Palawan to scope out a site of a new EDCA base. EDCA is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. I'm not actually going to go through all of the different agreements, but there is a long history of unequal military agreements, and EDCA specifically has allowed for the basing of US troops in Philippine facilities. And so EDCA, which is an executive agreement that was passed under Obama, actually, already had 5 different locations in which the US military had access to. And it's actually more egregious than having like outright US bases, because they don't have to pay rent, and their presence is actually it's more, it's harder to track because they are within Philippine facilities. And they can stockpile weapons, and they basically have access to the Philippines, but without having the official title of a US base, because the US bases were actually kicked out in the 90s. by the Filipino people. So in February, Marcos expanded upon this EDCA, the agreement, and announced 4 new locations on top of the existing 5. So there is now a total of 9. So you can see on the map here that there's 3 Philippine bases near Taiwan, one in Palawan and one in Palawan facing the South China Sea. So these are all the new ones here. And these are their names. and they're along what's called the First Island Chain, which is a network of missiles that are pointed towards China, and run by the US military, supposedly to counter missile attacks by China as well. And it runs from Japan to Taiwan, Philippines, down to Indonesia. Yeah, and it's all part of the US's plan to, counter and possibly have to defeat or destroy or go to war with their competitor, China. And then March to April, there were these military exercises called the Saliknib exercises between Philippine and US soldiers. And then, oh, and then here are some photos. Sorry, I just alternated them to show all the terrible things. And then the resistance, the very lively and dynamic US based movement for genuine democracy and liberation in the Philippines. So Bayan and other organizations who want to fight for free Philippines against the Marcos administration, mounted a week-long series of protests in September when he first visited the US in New York. And these are pictures of all of our martyrs. Yeah, and then and then this is a video that explains more in depth the Balikatan exercises, which I will actually go into more after the video.
I'm Ramon Clara, and this is your TSC News Now. We begin in New York's Times Square, where Filipino activists and anti-war allies protested the growing U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Protesters say this military posturing at the commencement of Balikatan, touted as the largest combat exercise in decades with more than 17,000 military personnel involved, is just another display of U.S. firepower in Asia. They are also protesting the United States military use of 4 new bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, which will bring the total of U.S.-controlled facilities in the Philippines to 9. Meanwhile, in a CSIS forum in Washington, D.C. earlier on Monday, Philippine Secretary of Foreign Affairs Enrique Manalo said, even with U.S. military presence in the Philippines, Philippine sovereignty is still protected.
Even though we may have our alliance and we may have activities, it should be in accordance with our constitutional requirements.
A similar protest took place in San Francisco by the iconic Golden Gate Bridge. Protesters say these joint military exercises do more harm than good.
We see the continued lack of attention that the Philippines has for the concerns of the people, for the indigenous people that the military exercises affect, for the women and children who are affected by continued military occupation, by having more and more soldiers, and also the impacts that it has environmentally.
Despite living abroad, they say it was necessary to protest the Balikatan military exercises.
This does affect us. 7,000 Filipinos leave the Philippines every day to find work abroad. Many of our families say, we're here because they're looking for a better life. And what we really want to emphasize is that if we do establish national sovereignty, if we can actually establish industrialization in the Philippines, for the Philippines and by its people, that we really can give that better life to the folks at home.
So that's another glimpse of the overview of the EDCA and the expansion of the bases, but also the resistance that we as Bayan had mounted against it across the country. Yes, definitely free Palestine. I'm just looking at the comments now. Yes, and Richard's comment of like not letting Filipinos becoming cannon fodder. And also, hi Rick. I see that you are coming to the US. There is definitely a movement here if you'd like to connect. So I will continue the timeline. So like the video already said, the largest ever balikatan exercises or shoulder to shoulder exercises happened from April 11th to April 28th. So this almost doubled this year, which was only 8,900. And some of the different exercises that was included was live fire exercises at sea. And the Balikatan exercises have historically been mostly land-based, but this is the first time that they included maritime exercises. So you can see that it really is targeted towards China and using the justification of the dispute over the West Philippine Sea to provoke war with China. So not so subtle, though they claim it's not targeted towards China. And at the same time, as the video said, the 2+2 ministerial dialogues were happening, where there's a discussion of military and economic interests in the Philippines, which included the implementation of the EDCA basis, acquiring more fighter jets for the Philippines, joint sail patrols by the US and Philippine navies, and counterterrorism efforts. So you can really see more and more how Marcos is really in the US camp, being embedded in the US camp. And then May 1 to 4, Marcos Jr. came to the US again. He spent a week in DC. And on May 1st, he met with Biden, which is International Workers' Day. So another affront to the Filipino working people all over the world. And while he was gone, there were tens of thousands of workers in the Philippines demanding a higher daily minimum wage. And their demand is not even $15 per day. You know, in the US, we're fighting for $15 minimum wage per hour, just to compare and contrast there. So they're not even getting $15 a day for a day's work. And Marcos has spent about 20% of his administration or his term outside the country. And so the workers were demanding, you know, where is Marcos? But he was talking to Biden. And so the outcomes of that talk was, the US-Philippine bilateral security guidelines, which is mostly negotiated in secret. There are different provisions to strengthen security between, or so-called security, but basically like defense exercises between the US and Philippines. Also, the establishment of the first ever US presidential trade and investment mission to the Philippines, which is a new initiative meant to get more foreign investment. And then also bilateral economic cooperation through the US-Philippine Trade and Investment Framework Agreement and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So basically talking about how to further sell out the Philippines to foreign interests. And then that evening, Marcos Jr. had a game show type of community welcoming at the Ritz-Carlton, one of the most expensive hotels. And then the next day, he also had a very fancy dinner with the ruling elite in the most expensive restaurant in DC called the Fiola Mare. There were actually multiple events that week, couldn't fit them all here, but you get the gist. And then he left at the end to go to England for the princess coronation. So you can see he's a very bougie guy. But as always, there was resistance mounted to his visit. We were there at every stop of his visit. Here is the pictures of our protest outside the White House while he was inside talking to Biden, saying US out of the Philippines, Marcos is not welcome here. And then here is another protest mounted in front of Kamala Harris's house because he also met with Kamala Harris. Here is one of our members, an migrante, who is a nurse, and he was addressing the so-called community welcoming of President Marcos because it was organized by the Philippine Nurses Association. Yeah, and then even in other places outside DC, there were actions to protest Marcos coming to the US. So, you know, while it seems very dire, or it is very dire, and the conditions, you know, are worsening every day, there is still very vibrant movement, not just in the Philippines, but also here in the US and around the world. So as Bayan USA, we're really excited to connect more with Pax Christi, continue building in solidarity with each other. Yeah, and if you have any local Pax Christi chapters, we would love to connect you with the local chapters of Bayan as well.
Thank you so much, Nina. Wow, I see the questions in the chat, and you did a fantastic job of weaving them into your answers or in your presentation. And I also see that Sarah has been active answering some questions in the chat. So what I'd like to propose is, rather than we're going to a question and answer session, because we only have a few minutes left, I'm going to propose handing it off to Rhiannon, who is going to share with us some action steps, some more ways to get involved. And I think Nina hit on a really good point of connecting Pax Christi USA chapters, Bayan USA chapters, and other movements for Filipino solidarity. So Rhiannon, who also goes by Annie, just so pleased to welcome you. She was also on the delegation to the Philippines this past few months ago. So Annie has been a member of Anak Bayan Philadelphia since 2020. Anak Bayan is a national youth-led, national democratic organization working for liberation in the Philippines. She finds her faith to be an inspiration for her political work and hopes that every person of faith can engage in service of the oppressed. Rhiannon is also a healthcare worker and believes the community should be at the center of all healthcare. Welcome, Rhiannon.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Rhiannon, or Annie. I was a part of the delegation, and I've been a member of Anak Bayan Philadelphia since it started in summer of 2020. I am located in Philadelphia on Lenni Lenape land. And I want to just quickly acknowledge the importance of faith work within with political work and with serving the people. There's this excerpt I read a while ago that I keep coming back to, and it's by Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, and it's from a book of his, and the excerpt reads, and this is referencing Genesis with Cain and Abel. Then when God asks him, "Where's your brother Abel?" he arrogantly responds, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" In essence, the entire Bible is written as an affirmative response to this question. And ever since I've read this, it's really impacted how I see political work, how I see myself and my faith, and really understanding that again and again, we are asked to be our brother's keeper, to serve all of those around us. Jesus asked us to feed his sheep and to care for his sheep. And so I think keeping these words and these principles at our heart at all times is really important. And being a part of this faith delegation really showed me that, and I was super inspired by all the faith leaders I met in the Philippines. I think really inspired by everyone from the NCCP I met. I'm really thankful for Chikai for coming on and speaking, because I think her talk was really eloquent in summarizing the need for faith within politics. So yeah, I just really want to thank everyone who's here as well. So now we can go into what can we do? So there's a couple different ways to get involved. One of the things we can concretely do here in the United States is pass the PHRA, which is the Philippine Human Rights Act. This will cut military spending to the Philippines. Between 2015 and 2022, $1.14 billion were sent from the US to the Philippines, which funded Duterte's war on drugs, counterinsurgency, and all sorts of horrible humanitarian crimes. It's also promoting the opening of the 4 new bases. Last I saw, there's going to be at least 6 million sent over to help build these bases. So our tax money is going to fund this. So supporting the PHRA, you can get this funding cut. It was reintroduced into Congress this past March by Pennsylvania Rep. Susan Wild. If you are in Pennsylvania, please mention in the chat or reach out later, because there is a really big push for those in PA who are Susan Wild's constituents to promote this. Also a push for PA Senator John Fetterman to introduce this bill as well, because right now it's only in the House and we want it to be pushed in the Senate. In addition to this, there are lobbying days that are coming up for the Philippine Human Rights Act, July 13th through 14th in DC. And so I believe, yes, so the one page about the Philippine Human Rights Act, the actions that can be taken and have been taken for the Philippine Human Rights Act and the toolkit are all linked there. You can sign on as an individual organization to this Philippine Human Rights Act. So I think it's one of the most concrete things we can do here in the United States. Take action against Marcos and APEC. So like Nina said, Marcos was in New York last September, and then Marcos was here again in May in DC, and he'll be coming back in November for the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, which will be a meeting of all different leaders in the Asia Pacific, meeting the United States to do all of these economic dealings. And Marcos Jr. will be present once again for this. And so once again, we are saying no to this conference, and we are saying no to President Marcos. There will be actions happening in San Francisco. So if you are located around there or know people, encourage them to go. And if you're not located there, but you still want to go, that's also really encouraged too. I'm out here on the East Coast, but we're still trying to mobilize our members to go out and protest against Marcos. Yeah, another way is to connect to an organization. So Bayan has member organizations all across the US you can connect to. There's Gabriela, there's Anak Bayan, Migrante, and League of Filipino Students. There's other Filipino human rights organizations. There's chapters of ICHRP, International Coalition for Human Rights, which were one of the groups that facilitated the trip that me, Roxana, and Michelle went on, as well as Malaya Movement, which has chapters across the United States. There's other solidarity organizations. Like Nina mentioned, drop your name, affiliation, email in the chat if you want to get connected. And then my special promotion for my organization, Anak Bayan Philly, is you can follow us on Instagram. We actually have a listserv. Our listserv is posted in the handout link that Michelle will be posting in the chat, and we can also send it if we do a follow-up email. But we do a monthly listserv summarizing what's happening locally in Philly, as well as what's happening in the Philippines. I've written a couple pieces about my trip in there, and a lot of our other members who are really incredible have been writing about the other work that is happening on the ground here and in the Philippines. You can also support us financially through our PayPal, which is anakbayanphilly@gmail.com. You can support us on that listserv Substack as well. Another really important thing is uplifting education about the Philippines. Anak Bayan Philadelphia in the past has had DSA Philly host us to present a short course of Philippine society and revolution. We also have been uplifted by Workers' World Party to facilitate another session of Philippine society and revolution. There's also the labor export policy we presented to the public. So connect to these local organizations, see if they'd be willing to host an educational discussion. And if you have a different platform or a bigger platform, use that platform to uplift these voices. You can also get your membership to attend national, international educational discussions hosted by organizers. I know Bayan has pretty frequent ones, and so you can encourage your membership to attend those. And you can also host panels like this with organizers nationally and internationally. And then you can also support and host report backs from the exposure trips. So I know I've done a couple report backs. I believe Michelle and Roxana have done report backs from the trips. Jordan, who's also in this chat, has done report backs. Being able to uplift and share these stories of these people we met on the ground in the Philippines is super important. And so being able to use your platform to uplift these voices is an extremely concrete way to help this movement. Yep. And then you can stay updated. Go to tinyurl.com/iChirp updates. That's way to stay updated with that particular group. And they are one of the ones that is spearheading the PHRA organizing.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. I am just so grateful for all of our panelists today, for logging on in the evening, for logging on in the early morning to share, to witness with all of us that are here. Johnny posted the one-page resource, and we will also share that out, which has multiple links. I feel like there's always the question of where are more articles or resources during webinars. And so we put it all in one handout that we will also email to everyone who registered. Like I said before, I feel like this conversation could keep going and keep going. But I just want to say thank you for the time that you are here. And our goal tonight was not to share everything that could be said, but to really hear from people who are most directly affected and see how our movements can continue to grow for Filipino liberation and partner. I'm reminded that Pax Christi, New Jersey just had an event with Malaya Movement this past couple of weeks. And so we will also share a little bit information recap on that. I'd like to lift up one piece in the chat. I think it's important to end on a note of hope and a note of solidarity. Our title, as you know, was witnessing in solidarity. And so this comment from Sister Jane Morrissey from the chat, who is our one of the Pax Christi USA ambassadors of peace, wrote quite simply, "I want to express my admiration and gratitude to the presenters for their courage and clarity in giving us the context of history with the specifics of repression. Although this is a huge vessel of context, you obviously know and let us see individual people and your solidarity with them by values we in Pax Christi hold dear. I find myself praying and learning simultaneously." So thank you again, everyone who joined. I'm going to ask our panelists if there is any last comment that you would like to make before we close.
Maybe for me, I want to thank you all for this event, but we can always go deeper by coming here to the Philippines, and I invite you to see the real and pulsating situation of the country, as this would also reflect many of the countries around the world that has been victimized by imperialism. And so we can solidify our work and solidarity with each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to share one important thing that I've learned from the progressive movement in the Philippines, that the most oppressed and exploited class in the Philippines is also a fighting class. And so I hope you keep that in mind as we forge international solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have much more to add. Just thank you so much, Pax Christi. We really hope to connect locally with you. Please, actually both Bayan USA organizations as well. If you're in a Bayan USA org, or if you're in a local Pax Christi org, please share your info in the chat and we'll try to connect you. It'd be great to continue building locally. As well as nationally. It's been such a joy to be in solidarity and coordinate and work with Pax Christi USA as Bayan USA.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, Nina, Chikai, and Rhiannon. And with that, I say thank you, amen, and we'll see you next time. Good night, everyone, and good morning.